Hi all, my name is Andre and you're on my YouTube channel where I try to make sense of economics and economic history. I've heard the phrase about the government printing money my whole life. They'll print money, turn on the printing press, and other similar phrases. So I decided to figure out what it actually is, what it means to print money, what it looks like, what the process is, what lies behind it, and so on. Let's imagine that we are a state, for example, Russia or America, and we're sitting down to draft our annual budget, listing all our expenses and all our income, just like anyone would. And it resulted in a deficit. So you wanted to buy a lot of things, you wanted to stock up on wild berries, and after all those calculations, it turned out that you just don't have enough money. For this month, someone will have to borrow. The same thing happens with states quite often. In fact, it's more common for states. Budgets are most often in deficit. It's not bad, it's normal, but it comes with its consequences. So, what are the ways to cover a deficit? Today, we're going to talk about the one that's called printing money. But I'll also share what other methods exist, so you'll know and can talk about all 5 methods during a smoke break or somewhere else. The first method is classic borrowing. It's just the government borrowing from banks, from classic people, from corporations, from many, many sources, just debt, like you probably sometimes borrow from your friends, acquaintances, or family to cover your expenses. The second way is to finance the deficit through the central bank. This is exactly the method that's called printing money. We'll talk about it in more detail today. The third method is to take money from someone like the International Monetary Fund. They give money for development, for all kinds of construction projects, for infrastructure projects. That is simply to cover the deficit with the help of, so to speak, other people's money. And as far as I know, it's known that you don't always have to pay them back. There are certain conditions, but overall, it's a bit softer than classic debt. The truth is, with this method, it can enslave you as a country. A country like the United States of America, well, that's a topic for a separate video. Another way to cover the deficit is to raise taxes. The government can raise various rates, take benefits, anything at all, just to cover the gap in the deficit. Of course, this method has a lot of downsides, but we won't focus on them today. And the last method is privatization of any kind. Enterprises, meaning the government can sell something, a factory, a road, anything at all, anything it owns, can be sold to private individuals. So, in that way, temporarily, meaning just once, cover only in the budget. As I already mentioned, today we're going to talk about the method that's most commonly referred to as printing money, turning on the printing press. That's financing through central banks. Many have heard that the budget of Russia for 2024, 2025, and 2026 has been drafted with a deficit of 4 trillion rubles. That's a large amount that needs to be sourced from somewhere. So, expenses will be high, while revenues will be lower, which makes a lot of sense. Let's try to figure out the most likely way. Where does the Russian government, the state, all these officials get their money from? They will take money to cover the deficit. The Ministry of Finance is issuing OFZ. OFZ stands for Federal Loan Bonds. It's basically a piece of paper that you, as a private investor, a banker, anyone, buy, and roughly speaking, the government borrows from you. The government borrowed money and pays it back with interest. A classic story. It pays out different interest rates there. They can vary completely. Well, there, 10, 15, depending on the state of the economy. This is a great way for the government because, technically speaking, no more money is being injected into the economy. So, no new money is being created. The government borrowed 100 rubles from you, so you have 100 rubles less. The government has 100 rubles more. No new money has appeared here. In other words, no money was printed. In this sense, this is a normal way, especially for powerful economies like the US, because their debt is bought. Different countries. It is highly liquid, reliable, and countries like China, South Korea, Japan, and any other countries buy all this debt at once. But what should a country like Russia do, which is currently under sanctions? Overall, the country has a bunch of problems and there aren't enough buyers for domestic debt in the internal market, meaning for these government bonds. So, in that case, let's take an example from my head. We need to raise 4 trillion rubles in 3 years. And the real government can sell 2 trillion to real people, meaning they need to find 2 trillion somewhere. This is where the central bank comes into play. The central bank gives loans to regular banks, like Tinkoff, Sber, any bank. Takes a loan, gets money from the central bank. The central bank is actually printing them. So this is new money that wasn't previously in the economy. They printed it, they gave it to the banks, and the banks in turn bought these government bonds. So it's for the printed money, basically printed. What does the bank do next? He takes these same OFZs and puts them in collateral, buys more government bonds. What is the benefit for a classic commercial bank in general? Let's say the central bank will take it new money, printed at 10% annual interest, while the government bonds are at 11 or 12%, let's say. I don't think you need to be a particularly good economist or mathematician to see that what you need to understand is that the bank will simply make money on the difference between these interest rates and will get its profit. What's important is that government bonds are quite reliable papers. The risk that the government won't repay its debts is very low, so these are reliable papers. For the banks, it's okay, it's not super risky, or a super risky venture. You might wonder, what's the point of all these complicated maneuvers? Why is the central bank involved? Why such a complex scheme? They could just print money and inject it into the economy, could have moved to the Accounts Ministry of Finance and distributed it across all government structures. And everything is fine. It's simple. There are no problems. Actually, there is a problem. It's prohibited by law. Direct money printing is banned in most civilized countries, and where it isn't banned, you end up with situations like Zimbabwe. I think many have heard about their local currency, which, by the way, was abolished in 2009, and the government switched to transactions in classic dollars. There, inflation was hundreds of thousands of %, and, well, it's clear that the economy is in such parameters cannot exist. So, the central bank acts as a sort of buffer, as a controller. And here, it's important to note that one of the main goals of any central bank is to control inflation. So it's not about killing it completely to zero, because that's also bad for the economy, but also not letting it skyrocket, so it doesn't end up like in Turkey. Right now, I think that those who buy games on Steam buy different subscriptions. Turkish accounts know that prices are going to rise significantly in the near future. But this is precisely because the Turkish lira is constantly, it falls into inflation. Usually the central bank simply tries to control it, keep and reduce, and in fact, in this case, the central bank is needed to slightly suppress inflation and prevent such money printing so that inflation is there of cosmic proportions. It acts as a sort of protector. Of course, if we're talking about additional money printing, which is actually happening, if the central bank issued this money that banks use to buy bonds, then, of course, inflation will occur. The ruble, in the specific case of Russia, will weaken. Well, this is a normal economic practice that, unfortunately, is almost impossible to avoid in the modern world. Most likely, a careful viewer has pondered in the context of my discussion about budgets, deficits, national debt, and everything else. The main national debt in the world is the national debt of the United States, which currently stands at over $33 trillion, which is a lot, making up about 120% of GDP. By the way, these aren't the most astronomical figures. In Venezuela, Japan, and many other countries, it exceeds 200%, and in Venezuela, it even goes over 300%. So, for such a powerful economy, such a strong economy as the United States economy, it's not that critical. But still, the question is, how are things going with the national debt? How do they address the deficit, which has been stable since 2002 and is in the red? Basically, if you look at the graph of income and expenses in the United States, there will be very few peaks where income exceeds expenses. But we'll talk about this. In the next videos, we'll discuss this issue and delve into it in more detail. If you're worried that you'll miss the video about the US national debt, for sure, subscribe, hit the bell, and then you definitely won't miss anything, and you'll be the smartest one in your kitchen. Thank you very much. Goodbye.